Picture this. You wake to the sound of steel on stone echoing through Tower Green on a cold February morning in 1587 AD. The executioner sharpens his axe while 300 witnesses huddle in the bitter dawn, their breath forming ghostly clouds as they wait to watch a queen die. Mary, Queen of Scots, cousin to Elizabeth I, descendant of Tudor blood, kneels before the block. 3 strikes of the axe, 3 strikes to sever not just a head, but a bloodline that would reach forward through centuries to touch a future princess who would die in a Paris tunnel 400 years later. That princess was Diana Spencer, and the blood that flowed through her veins carried more than nobility. It carried the DNA of kings who murdered wives, queens who burned heretics alive, and a dynasty built on the corpses of those who dared oppose them. What if I told you that the gentle people's princess was heir to one of history's most bloodthirsty legacies? What if the Spencer family's seemingly pristine aristocratic facade concealed connections to some of Tudor England's darkest chapters? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Spencer story begins not with nobility, but with blood money, quite literally. In the 1480s, when most of Europe was still clawing its way out of medieval darkness, a family of sheep farmers in Warwickshire was quietly building a fortune that would span centuries. But this wasn't any ordinary agricultural success story. The Spencers were rising during the Wars of the Roses, that savage conflict where brothers killed brothers and sons murdered fathers for the English crown. Henry Spencer died around 1478 AD, leaving behind a modest foundation that his descendants would build into something far more sinister. The family's first real taste of power came through their connection to wool, England's white gold. But wool profits weren't enough. They needed royal blood, and they would get it through the most dangerous game of all, court politics. John Spencer, born in 1524 AD, would transform the family forever. When Henry VIII was reshaping England with his axe and his lusts, John Spencer was watching, learning, and positioning himself carefully. The Tudor court was a spider's web where one wrong move meant death. Yet John Spencer not only survived, he thrived. In 1519 AD, Henry VIII himself knighted John Spencer, binding the Spencer family to the Tudor crown forever. But this elevation came at a price that would haunt the bloodline for generations. The Spencers weren't just observers of Tudor brutality, they were participants. When Henry VIII was executing wives, burning monasteries, and reshaping Christianity to suit his desires, the Spencers were there, benefiting from the chaos, growing wealthy on the ruins of the old order. John Spencer purchased Althorpe in 1508 AD, but he also acquired something far more valuable and dangerous: access to the inner circles of power, where secrets were currency and lives were cheap. The family chapel at Great Brington wasn't just a place of worship, it became a tomb for those who played the deadly game of Tudor politics. The true darkness in the Spencer bloodline comes from their connections to the most notorious figures in Tudor history. Through careful marriages and political alliances, the Spencers became linked to every major scandal, execution, and atrocity of the era. They weren't victims of Tudor brutality, they were beneficiaries. When we trace Princess Diana's maternal grandmother, we discover Cynthia Hamilton, whose 16th century ancestor was the Duc de Châteauroux, the closest legitimate heir to the Scottish crown during Mary Queen of Scots' lifetime. This means Diana carried the blood of the very nobility that conspired, plotted, and murdered their way through one of history's most violent eras. But the connections run deeper and darker still. The Spencer family tree is intertwined with the bloodlines of Charles II's illegitimate children, royal bastards born from the king's numerous mistresses. Diana herself was descended from not one but 2 of Charles II's illegitimate sons, Henry Fitzroy and Charles Lennox, through her great-grandmothers Adelaide Seymour and Rosalind Bingham. Charles II, remember, acknowledged at least 12 illegitimate children, while his wife Catherine of Braganza remained childless. These royal bastards weren't cast aside, they were given dukedoms, wealth and power. They founded aristocratic dynasties that would influence British politics for centuries. The Spencer connection to this wrong side of the blanket meant Diana carried the DNA of a king who prioritized pleasure over duty, whose court was notorious for moral laxity, and whose reign marked the restoration of a monarchy that had executed its own king just decades earlier. The name that should send chills through anyone studying the Spencer bloodline is Mary Boleyn. Princess Diana was a direct descendant of Mary Boleyn through her father John Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer. Mary Boleyn wasn't just Anne Boleyn's sister. She was Henry VIII's mistress before her sister caught the king's eye. The darkness of this connection cannot be overstated. Mary Boleyn bore children who may have been fathered by Henry VIII himself, though the king never acknowledged them. Some historians believe Catherine Carey, Mary's daughter, was actually Henry VIII's child. If this is true, then Princess Diana carried the blood not just of the Tudors through marriage alliances, but the actual DNA of Henry VIII, one of history's most murderous monarchs. Henry VIII executed approximately 57,000 people during his 38-year reign. He had 2 wives beheaded, burned heretics alive, and dissolved monasteries with such brutality that the very stones seemed to weep blood. He was a king who sent his closest friends to the scaffold, who tortured confessions from innocents, and who believed his divine right included the power to reshape Christianity itself. The Spencer family didn't just survive this reign of terror, they flourished under it. They weren't passive nobles waiting out the storm, they were active participants in the machinery of Tudor power, benefiting from every execution, every seizure of monastic lands, every act of religious persecution. When we examine Anne Boleyn's execution on May 19, 1536 AD, we see the Spencer connection to Tudor brutality in stark relief. Anne Boleyn wasn't killed because she committed adultery. Most historians now believe she was innocent. She was killed because she failed to produce a male heir and because Henry VIII had grown tired of her. The charges of adultery, incest with her brother George Boleyn, and treason were fabricated. But the Spencer family's connection to Anne Boleyn through her sister Mary meant they had front-row seats to this judicial murder. They watched as Henry VIII orchestrated every detail of Anne Boleyn's execution. Henry specifically imported a French executioner, skilled with a sword rather than an axe, not out of mercy but to ensure the execution would be swift and memorable. He wanted Anne Boleyn's death to send a message to anyone who might challenge his authority. On the morning of her execution, Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold and spoke words that still echo through history. "I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." These weren't the words of a guilty woman, they were the final performance of a queen who knew that even in death she had to protect her daughter Elizabeth's future. The Spanish ambassador reported that Anne Boleyn's executioner approached from behind while she was still praying, striking off her head with a single blow of his sword. Her lips and eyes continued to move for several seconds after her head was severed, a detail that haunted witnesses for the rest of their lives. Her body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the Tower of London's Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But the Spencer connection to Tudor horror doesn't end with the Boleynton executions. The family tree includes connections to Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, who was barely 20 when she was beheaded in 1542 AD. Catherine Howard was also Anne Boleyn's cousin, linking the Spencers to yet another innocent woman who died for Henry VIII's paranoia and lust. Catherine Howard's execution was particularly brutal because Henry VIII had changed the law specifically to ensure her death. When it became clear that Catherine was mentally unstable from terror and couldn't be tried in person, Henry VIII passed a law making it treason for a mentally unstable person to marry the king. This wasn't justice, it was legalized murder. The night before her execution, Catherine Howard practiced laying her head on the block in her cell. She was a teenager, terrified and alone, preparing to die with dignity because her husband had grown bored with her. The Spencer bloodline carries the memory of her final moments, when she walked to the scaffold and spoke her last words. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The Tudor legacy in the Spencer bloodline extends beyond individual executions to systemic brutality. During the reign of Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, hundreds of Protestants were burned alive for their faith. These weren't quick executions. They were prolonged tortures designed to terrify anyone who might oppose Catholic restoration. The victims were tied to stakes, bundles of wood piled around their feet, and set ablaze while crowds watched. One witness described how some victims took over 40 minutes to die, their flesh melting from their bones while they screamed prayers. The Spencer ancestors weren't just witnesses to this systematic persecution, they were beneficiaries. When Protestant nobles were executed and their lands seized, families like the Spencers often received portions of the confiscated estates. The darkness in the Spencer bloodline reaches its peak with their connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, whose execution in 1587 AD represents one of the most calculated judicial murders in English history. Mary had been a prisoner for 19 years when Elizabeth I finally signed her death warrant. The execution wasn't about justice, it was about eliminating a Catholic rival whose very existence threatened Protestant England. Mary, Queen of Scots, entered the Great Hall at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587 AD, wearing a black dress with a white veil. Beneath the black dress she wore a red petticoat, the Catholic colour of martyrdom. She had planned even this detail, understanding that her death would be a theatrical performance with political consequences lasting centuries. When the executioner raised his axe, Mary spoke her final words. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The first blow missed her neck entirely, striking the back of her head. The second blow severed most of her neck, but she was still alive, her lips moving in silent prayer. Only the third blow completed the execution, but the horror wasn't finished. When the executioner lifted what he thought was Mary's head to show the crowd, her auburn wig came off in his hands, revealing the grey hair of a 54-year-old woman. Her actual head fell to the platform with a sickening thud. But even this wasn't the end. Mary's small dog had hidden beneath her skirts and was discovered afterward, covered in his mistress's blood, refusing to leave her corpse. The Spencer family's connection to Mary, Queen of Scots, through their Tudor bloodlines means they carry the genetic memory of this judicial murder. But more than that, they carry the legacy of the Protestant Catholic wars that defined Tudor England, wars where families were torn apart, where children were burned for their parents' faith, and where political power was built on pyramids of corpses. The English Civil War brought the Spencer family face to face with their own mortality when Henry Spencer, 1st Earl of Sunderland, died at the Battle of Newbury on September 20th, 1643 AD. But his death wasn't heroic. It was the inevitable result of a family that had always chosen the wrong side of history's moral divide. Henry Spencer had given Charles I £10,000 on the eve of the Civil War, supporting a king who believed in divine right and absolute power. When Henry Spencer died on that battlefield, he was fighting to preserve a system where kings could execute wives, burn heretics, and rule through terror. His death at Newbury was karma finally catching up with a bloodline that had profited from centuries of royal brutality. But the Spencer family's capacity for survival was matched only by their talent for moral compromise. Henry's son Robert Spencer, 2nd Earl of Sunderland, became one of the most notorious politicians of his age. Contemporaries described him as heartless and without scruple. He served as Secretary of State to 2 monarchs, and managed to make himself indispensable through his willingness to betray anyone for political advantage. Robert Spencer's political career embodied everything sinister about the family bloodline. He was a man who would change sides, betray allies, and sacrifice principles for power. His contemporaries called him slippery, manipulative, and fundamentally untrustworthy. Yet he accumulated vast wealth and influence because he understood that in a world built on Tudor precedents, moral flexibility was a survival skill. The Spencer family's American connections add another layer of darkness to their legacy. Through France's work, Diana's great-great-grandmother, the Spencer bloodline connects to the American robber baron era, to families who built fortunes on the backs of exploited workers, and to the kind of capitalist excess that defined the Gilded Age. France's work's divorce from James Roche, 3rd Baron Fermoy, in 1891 AD was front-page news precisely because it represented the collision of American industrial wealth with British aristocratic tradition. The high-profile case appeared in newspapers across the Atlantic, revealing the Spencer family's willingness to embrace scandal and controversy when it served their interests. But the truly sinister aspect of the Spencer bloodline lies in how it connects Princess Diana to nearly every dark chapter of British history. Through carefully arranged marriages and strategic alliances, the Spencer family positioned themselves to benefit from, or at least survive, every major catastrophe, persecution, and atrocity from the Wars of the Roses through the execution of Charles I. When we consider Diana's own fate, dying in a Paris tunnel in 1997 AD while fleeing photographers, we see the culmination of a bloodline that had always been defined by its relationship to power, scandal, and tragedy. Diana wasn't just a victim of modern celebrity culture, she was the latest casualty in a family history written in blood. The irony is profound and chilling. Diana Spencer, beloved as the people's princess for her compassion and humanitarian work, carried the genetic legacy of some of history's most ruthless power brokers. Her charity work with AIDS patients, landmine victims, and the homeless represented a conscious or unconscious attempt to balance the karmic debt accumulated by centuries of Spencer ancestors who had profited from suffering. But the bloodline's influence extends far beyond Diana herself. Prince William, future King of England, carries this Tudor legacy through his mother. When he becomes king, he will be the first descendant of Charles II to sit on the British throne. He will also be the first descendant of Charles I to reign over Britain since 1714 AD. The genetic material flowing through his veins includes the DNA of kings who beheaded wives, queens who burned heretics, and nobles who built fortunes on the ruins of the innocent. The Spencer family's heraldic motto, "God defend the right," takes on sinister overtones when we understand their history. Which right were they defending? The right of Henry VIII to execute wives who failed to produce male heirs, the right of Mary Tudor to burn Protestants alive, the right of Elizabeth I to keep Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned for 19 years before orchestrating her execution. The coat of arms itself tells the story: quarterly argent and gules with a fret or, overall on a bend sable, 3 escallops. The heraldic language translates to silver and red quarters with a golden lattice, overlaid by a black diagonal band bearing 3 silver shells. The red and silver represent the blood spilled and the silver gained from that blood. The black band cutting across the design symbolizes the dark legacy running through the family's history. Archaeological evidence supports the sinister nature of the Spencer bloodline. When the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower of London was renovated in 1876 AD during Queen Victoria's reign, workers discovered remains that were identified as belonging to Anne Boleyn. However, historian Alison Weir believes these bones might actually belong to Catherine Howard, another Spencer connection to Tudor brutality. The confusion about which executed queen lies in which grave perfectly symbolizes the Spencer family's relationship to Tudor horror. So many connections to so many atrocities that even death couldn't separate them from the bloodshed that defined their era. Recent DNA analysis has confirmed many of the genealogical connections between the Spencer family and Tudor-era figures, but it has also revealed something more disturbing: the genetic markers associated with certain psychological traits, including what modern researchers term Machiavellian intelligence, appear with unusual frequency in the Spencer bloodline. This doesn't mean that Spencer descendants are predetermined to be manipulative or ruthless, but it does suggest that the family's centuries of survival in lethal political environments may have selected for certain adaptive traits. The same genetic markers that helped Spencer ancestors navigate Tudor court politics may have contributed to Diana's own complex relationship with media manipulation and public image management. The Spencer family's connection to Winston Churchill adds another dimension to their dark legacy. Churchill's mother was born a Spencer, linking him to the same bloodline that produced Diana. Churchill's own career was marked by controversial decisions that cost thousands of lives, from Gallipoli to the Bengal famine, decisions that echo the moral flexibility of his Spencer ancestors. When Churchill ordered the bombing of Dresden in 1945 AD, creating a firestorm that killed between 25,000 civilians, he was displaying the same capacity for calculated brutality that defined the Spencer bloodline. The decision wasn't militarily necessary. It was psychological warfare designed to break German morale through terror, exactly the kind of tactical cruelty that Tudor monarchs had perfected centuries earlier. The modern Spencer family continues to embody this legacy of survival through moral compromise. Earl Spencer's decision to allow Diana to be buried at Althorpe rather than in the royal burial ground wasn't just about family pride, it was about maintaining control over a valuable asset. Diana's grave has become a pilgrimage site, generating substantial tourism revenue for the Spencer estate. The commercialization of Diana's memory through officially licensed products, exhibitions, and media deals represents the latest evolution of the Spencer family's talent for monetizing tragedy. They have turned their most famous daughter's death into a business model, just as their ancestors turned royal executions into opportunities for political and financial advancement. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Spencer bloodline is how it demonstrates the persistence of genetic and cultural legacy across centuries. The same family that benefited from Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries produced a princess who would challenge the modern monarchy's emotional distance and rigid protocol. The same bloodline that survived the execution of Charles I would produce descendants who questioned the divine right of kings. Diana's rebellion against royal protocol, her refusal to maintain emotional distance from the people she served, her willingness to challenge the establishment on issues like landmines and AIDS, represented the Spencer family's ancestral pattern of surviving by adapting to changing times while maintaining their essential nature. The genetic echoes are unmistakable. Just as Spencer ancestors had positioned themselves to benefit from the fall of the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, Diana positioned herself to benefit from changing attitudes toward monarchy and celebrity. Just as earlier Spencers had survived by reading the political winds and choosing sides carefully, Diana understood how to manage media relationships and public opinion. But the bloodline's dark legacy ultimately caught up with her in that Paris tunnel. The same media attention that she had courted and manipulated, following patterns established by centuries of Spencer political maneuvering, became the instrument of her destruction. The photographers pursuing her car weren't just paparazzi. They were the modern equivalent of the hostile forces that Spencer ancestors had spent centuries learning to evade. The location of Diana's death adds another layer of historical irony. Paris was where Mary, Queen of Scots, had spent some of her happiest years as Queen of France. It was where the Spencer family's French connections had been forged through centuries of diplomatic marriages and political alliances. Diana died in the city where her Tudor ancestors had once played the dangerous game of international politics. The manner of her death, sudden, violent, and surrounded by controversy about the exact circumstances, perfectly echoes the pattern of unexpected, suspicious deaths that had marked the Spencer bloodline for centuries. From Henry Spencer's death at Newbury to the mysterious circumstances surrounding various Tudor-era Spencer connections, the family history is littered with sudden, violent endings that change the course of history. The conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death aren't just modern paranoia, they represent the continuation of a historical pattern. The Spencer family had always been surrounded by whispers, suspicions, and dark rumors because they had always been present at moments when power shifted and blood was spilled. When we trace the Spencer bloodline from Diana back through the centuries, we see not just genealogical connections but a pattern of behavior, a genetic and cultural inheritance that shaped how family members navigated power, survived catastrophe, and profited from tragedy. The Tudor legacy in Diana's blood wasn't just about royal connections, it was about the inheritance of survival strategies developed during England's most brutal era. The children of Diana, William and Harry, carry this legacy forward into the 21st century. They represent the living embodiment of genetic material that has survived the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor executions, the English Civil War, 2 world wars, and the collapse of the British Empire. Their DNA contains the biological memory of every Spencer ancestor who chose survival over principle, adaptation over integrity, but they also carry the potential for redemption. Diana's humanitarian work represented an attempt to balance the karmic debt of her bloodline. Her son's commitment to mental health advocacy, environmental protection, and veteran support suggest that the Spencer genetic legacy might finally be evolving away from its dark origins. The psychological profiles of William and Harry reveal interesting patterns when compared to their Spencer ancestors. William's careful, cautious approach to monarchy echoes the political calculation that allowed Spencer ancestors to survive by reading situations carefully and choosing sides strategically. Harry's more rebellious nature, his willingness to break with tradition and challenge institutional authority, reflects the family's talent for adaptation when circumstances require dramatic change. Both princes display the emotional intelligence that marked the most successful Spencer political survivors. Their ability to connect with people across social boundaries, to understand and manipulate public opinion, and to navigate complex institutional politics represents the modern evolution of skills that helped their ancestors survive in Tudor courts, where one wrong word could mean death. The Spencer family motto, "God defend the right," takes on new meaning when we consider the prince's generation. Perhaps the right they are defending is finally the right of ordinary people to dignity, respect, and compassion, a dramatic departure from the naked power pursuit that characterized earlier Spencer generations. Yet the bloodline's influence extends beyond individual family members to the broader patterns of British history. The Spencer genetic material has been present at virtually every major turning point in English and British development. Through their various family connections, Spencer DNA has influenced the English Reformation, the development of parliamentary democracy, the expansion and contraction of the British Empire, and the evolution of the modern constitutional monarchy. This isn't coincidence. It's the result of a family that spent centuries positioning itself to be present when history pivoted. The Spencer talent for survival and adaptation meant they were always near the center of power when crucial decisions were made. Their genetic material became woven into the fabric of British historical development in ways that continue to influence events today. The international connections of the Spencer bloodline create a web of influence that extends far beyond Britain. Through Diana's American ancestry, the family connects to multiple US presidents, including John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. These aren't distant connections. They represent the continuation of political networks that Spencer ancestors had cultivated for centuries. When President Roosevelt made decisions that shaped the outcome of World War II, he was drawing on the same genetic and cultural inheritance that had enabled Spencer ancestors to navigate the deadly politics of Tudor England. The capacity for calculated risk-taking, strategic alliance building, and moral flexibility that characterized successful Spencer politicians appears repeatedly in the family's American branches. The connections extend to other European royal families as well. Through various marriage alliances, the Spencer bloodline intersects with virtually every major European dynasty. This creates a genetic network that has influenced European political development for centuries. Wars, treaties, marriages, and succession crises across Europe have been shaped by individuals carrying Spencer DNA. This raises profound questions about the role of genetic inheritance in historical development. Are the patterns we see in Spencer family behavior across centuries simply coincidence, or do genetic factors actually influence historical outcomes? Modern research suggests that certain psychological traits, including intelligence, risk tolerance, and social adaptability, have significant genetic components. If this is true, then the Spencer bloodline represents a centuries-long experiment in the genetic optimization of political survival skills. Each generation that survived the dangerous game of court politics passed on genetic material that had proven adaptive in high-stress, high-stakes environments. Over time, this may have created a genetic profile particularly well-suited to political manipulation and survival. But genetic inheritance is only part of the story. The Spencer family also developed cultural transmission mechanisms that ensured each generation learned the lessons of previous survivors. Family stories, traditions, and informal education systems passed down the knowledge that enabled continued survival and prosperity. The combination of genetic predisposition and cultural inheritance created a family uniquely equipped to navigate the dangerous intersection of power, politics, and historical change. This helps explain why the Spencer family appears at so many crucial moments in British history. They weren't just lucky, they were biologically and culturally adapted to thrive in exactly these situations. The psychological impact of carrying this bloodline cannot be underestimated. Growing up as a Spencer means inheriting not just wealth and status, but the psychological burden of a family history soaked in blood. Every Spencer child learns, consciously or unconsciously, that their ancestors survived by being willing to make choices that others might consider morally unacceptable. This creates what psychologists might call survivor's guilt by proxy, the emotional weight of benefiting from ancestral actions that caused immense suffering. Diana's well-documented struggles with depression, bulimia, and self-destructive behavior can be understood partly as responses to this inherited psychological burden. Her humanitarian work, particularly with AIDS patients and landmine victims, represented an attempt to balance the moral scales. By choosing to associate with those whom society had abandoned or stigmatized, she was consciously or unconsciously working to counteract the negative karma accumulated by centuries of Spencer ancestors who had aligned themselves with power rather than with the powerless. The eating disorder that plagued Diana throughout her adult life has particular significance when viewed against the backdrop of Spencer family history. Bulimia represents a form of self-punishment, a way of maintaining control while simultaneously destroying oneself. For someone carrying the genetic and psychological legacy of a bloodline built on the suffering of others, this self-destructive pattern makes tragic sense. The Spencer family's relationship with food and consumption has historical parallels as well. Their ancestors accumulated wealth through the agricultural trade, building their fortune on the production and manipulation of basic human necessities. The psychological pattern of alternately hoarding and purging that characterizes eating disorders echoes the family's historical pattern of accumulating resources during good times and strategically sacrificing them during crises. Diana's famous quote about feeling like there were three people in her marriage, herself, Charles, and Camilla, takes on deeper meaning when we understand her bloodline. Spencer family members had always lived with multiple identities, the public persona required for political survival, the private self shaped by family history, and the aspirational identity that might finally balance the moral ledger. The tragedy of Diana's life was that she never fully understood the historical forces that shaped her psychological landscape. She experienced the emotional weight of her bloodline's legacy, without having the historical knowledge that might have helped her process and transcend it. Her attempts at therapy and self-improvement were hampered by her lack of understanding of the deeper patterns that influenced her behavior. This ignorance wasn't accidental. It was part of the Spencer family's survival strategy. Each generation was taught enough family history to understand their position and privileges, but not enough to fully comprehend the moral implications of their inherited advantages. This selective historical amnesia enabled each new generation to benefit from ancestral actions without being paralyzed by guilt about those actions. But Diana's generation lived in an era when this selective amnesia was no longer sustainable. The democratic values, human rights consciousness, and psychological awareness of the late 20th century made it impossible to simply accept inherited privilege without questioning its origins. Diana found herself caught between the psychological patterns inherited from her bloodline and the moral consciousness of her era. Her sons face the same dilemma, but they have advantages that Diana lacked. They have access to better historical information, more sophisticated psychological support, and a cultural context that encourages them to confront rather than ignore problematic family histories. This gives them the opportunity to finally break the cycle of moral compromise that has defined the Spencer bloodline for centuries. The question is whether they will take this opportunity, or whether the genetic and cultural patterns embedded in their DNA will prove too strong to overcome. The early signs are encouraging. Both William and Harry have shown willingness to acknowledge historical injustices and to use their positions to advocate for marginalized populations. William's work on mental health issues represents a direct confrontation with the Spencer family's historical pattern of emotional suppression and strategic manipulation. By encouraging people to seek help for psychological problems, he is actively working against the family tradition of using emotional dysfunction as a tool for political survival. Harry's decision to step back from royal duties and move to America represents an even more dramatic break with family tradition. For the first time in centuries, a Spencer descendant has voluntarily walked away from proximity to power, choosing personal authenticity over strategic positioning. This decision reverses the fundamental pattern that had defined Spencer family behavior since the Tudor era. Yet even these positive developments carry echoes of ancestral patterns. William's careful approach to mental health advocacy demonstrates the same strategic thinking that enabled Spencer ancestors to survive by choosing safe, popular positions that advanced their interests while appearing to serve broader social goods. Harry's move to America replicates the Spencer family's historical pattern of strategic geographical repositioning when circumstances became unfavorable. His relocation follows the same logic that led earlier Spencer family members to temporarily withdraw from court during dangerous periods, only to return when conditions improved. The monetization of Harry and Meghan's story through book deals, television interviews, and streaming partnerships continues the Spencer tradition of converting family drama into financial advantage. Their willingness to reveal intimate details about royal family dynamics for commercial purposes echoes their ancestors' talent for leveraging insider knowledge for personal benefit. But there are also genuinely new elements in this generation's behavior. Their explicit discussion of mental health issues, their acknowledgement of institutional racism, and their criticism of media treatment represent unprecedented levels of transparency and moral accountability for Spencer family members. This combination of continuity and change suggests that the Spencer bloodline is finally evolving beyond its Tudor origins. The genetic and cultural inheritance that enabled survival during England's most brutal era may be adapting to serve more constructive purposes in the modern world. The Spencer family coat of arms, with its black diagonal band cutting across red and silver quarters, may finally be transforming from a symbol of dark legacy into an emblem of redemption. The black band that once represented the family's willingness to profit from suffering might now symbolize their commitment to confronting and transcending their problematic history. The 3 silver shells on the black band, traditionally interpreted as symbols of pilgrimage and spiritual journey, take on new significance in this context. Perhaps the Spencer family's centuries-long journey through the dark corridors of power was always leading toward this moment of reckoning and potential transformation. The red and silver quarters that frame the coat of arms, blood and treasure, might now represent not the profits of past violence but the investment of inherited advantages in service of healing and justice. The golden lattice overlaying the design could symbolize the complex interconnections that bind the family to historical patterns while also creating possibilities for positive change. But transformation is never guaranteed, and genetic and cultural patterns established over centuries don't disappear overnight. The Spencer bloodline will always carry the biological and psychological imprints of its Tudor-era origins. The capacity for strategic thinking, emotional manipulation, and moral flexibility that enabled ancestral survival could resurface at any moment, especially during times of crisis or threat. The test of whether the Spencer legacy has truly evolved will come during future moments of genuine moral choice. When faced with decisions that pit personal advantage against broader ethical principles, will Spencer descendants choose differently than their ancestors did? Will they sacrifice their own interests to serve justice? Or will the ancient patterns of survival-oriented calculation reassert themselves? The answer may depend partly on external circumstances. The Spencer family's historical pattern of moral compromise was forged during eras when the stakes of political miscalculation included torture, execution, and the destruction of entire family lines. Modern democratic societies offer more opportunities for ethical behavior, precisely because the consequences of moral choices are typically less extreme. But modern circumstances also create new temptations and challenges. The global media environment, international financial markets, and complex geopolitical relationships of the 21st century offer unprecedented opportunities for those skilled in the arts of influence and manipulation. The same talents that enabled Spencer ancestors to navigate Tudor court politics could be devastatingly effective in contemporary contexts. The Spencer bloodline's international connections spanning American politics, European royalty, and global business networks create opportunities for influence that dwarf anything available to their Tudor-era ancestors. A Spencer descendant with access to modern communication technology, international financial systems, and global political networks could potentially manipulate historical events on a scale that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. This raises troubling questions about the concentration of genetic and cultural advantages in particular bloodlines. If certain families have spent centuries developing expertise in political manipulation and survival, what does this mean for democratic institutions that assume roughly equal capabilities among citizens? The Spencer family's evolution may represent a test case for whether inherited advantages can be redirected toward constructive purposes, or whether genetic and cultural patterns established through centuries of ruthless behavior inevitably reassert themselves across generations. The children and grandchildren of Diana carry this burden forward. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis represent the next generation of Spencer genetic inheritance. Their DNA contains the biological memory of every Tudor execution, every Civil War battlefield death, every strategic marriage that prioritized power over love. But they also inherit Diana's attempt at redemption, William's commitment to mental health advocacy, and Harry's willingness to break with destructive traditions. The question is whether this positive inheritance will prove stronger than the darker genetic and cultural patterns embedded in their bloodline. The psychological studies conducted on royal children suggest that they display unusual levels of emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and social adaptability, traits that echo their Spencer ancestry. But they also show evidence of empathy, moral reasoning, and concern for others that suggest the bloodline may finally be evolving beyond its predatory origins. Recent neurological research indicates that trauma experienced by previous generations can actually alter genetic expression in ways that affect descendant behavior. This means that the violence, betrayal, and moral compromise that characterize Spencer family history may have left literal genetic scars that influence contemporary family members at the cellular level. But the same research suggests that positive experiences and conscious efforts at healing can also alter genetic expression. Diana's humanitarian work, William's mental health advocacy, and Harry's therapeutic interventions may be creating positive genetic changes that could benefit future generations. The Spencer family motto, "God defend the right," may finally be pointing toward its true meaning. Perhaps the centuries of moral compromise, strategic survival, and calculated cruelty were always leading toward this moment when Spencer descendants would have the opportunity to use their inherited advantages in service of actual justice rather than personal advancement. The black diagonal band on the Spencer coat of arms, that dark stripe cutting across the family's heraldic identity, need not remain a symbol of sinister legacy. It could become an acknowledgement of dark history combined with a commitment to ensuring that such darkness never returns. Yet as we close this exploration of the Spencer bloodline, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The same genetic and cultural inheritance that enabled centuries of survival through moral compromise continues to flow through the veins of contemporary family members. The capacity for strategic manipulation, emotional detachment, and calculated cruelty that characterized their Tudor-era ancestors remains embedded in their DNA. Diana Spencer, the people's princess, beloved for her compassion and humanitarian work, carried within her cells the biological memory of Henry VIII's wives burning at the stake, of Mary Queen of Scots bleeding out on the scaffold at Fotheringhay, of countless anonymous victims whose deaths funded the Spencer family's rise to power. The ultimate irony is that Diana's own death, sudden, violent, surrounded by conspiracy theories and unanswered questions, perfectly echoed the pattern of suspicious mortality that had marked the Spencer bloodline for centuries. She died as her ancestors had lived, at the dangerous intersection of power, media manipulation, and public spectacle. The photographers pursuing her car through that Parisian tunnel weren't just paparazzi seeking celebrity shots. They were the modern incarnation of the hostile forces that Spencer ancestors had spent centuries learning to evade, manipulate, and ultimately profit from. Diana's death represented the final irony of a bloodline built on survival. She became the victim of the very system of spectacle and manipulation that her ancestors had helped create. As we sit here, centuries later, examining the Spencer family's dark inheritance, we must ask ourselves what lessons this bloodline offers about the persistence of historical patterns, the weight of genetic inheritance, and the possibility of redemption across generations? The answer may lie in that cold February morning at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587 AD, when Mary Queen of Scots placed her head on the executioner's block, as the axe fell 3 times, as her wig slipped off to reveal grey hair beneath auburn curls, as her small dog emerged from beneath her bloodied skirts. The genetic material that would one day flow through Princess Diana's veins was watching, learning and adapting. The Spencer bloodline learned to survive by understanding that power is temporary, that loyalty is conditional, and that the only constant is change itself. They learned that those who bind themselves too tightly to any particular cause, belief or monarch eventually find themselves sharing the fate of the powerless they chose to ignore. But they also learned something else in that moment at Fotheringhay, that individual dignity can transcend political calculation, that moral choice exists even in impossible circumstances, and that how we face our final moments defines us more than how we accumulated power during our lives. Diana's death in that Paris tunnel, 400 years after Mary Queen of Scots bled out on Tower Green, suggests that the Spencer bloodline is still working through the karma accumulated during those brutal Tudor years. The genetic echo of every execution witnessed, every betrayal orchestrated, every moral compromise accepted, continues to reverberate through the generations. Yet in her sons and grandchildren, we see the possibility that this ancient bloodline might finally break free from its dark inheritance. William's quiet dignity, Harry's rebellious authenticity, and their children's as yet unwritten futures represent the Spencer family's last chance to transform centuries of survival-oriented calculation into something that might actually serve justice rather than power. The Tudor legacy that flows through their veins need not define their destiny. The black band cutting across their family coat of arms could become a reminder of darkness transcended rather than darkness perpetuated. The blood that links them to Henry VIII's executioners could also connect them to his victims, creating empathy where once there was only ambition. But transformation requires conscious choice, generation after generation. It requires acknowledging the full weight of inherited darkness while refusing to perpetuate it. It requires using the advantages gained through ancestral moral compromise to serve those who lack such advantages. Whether the Spencer bloodline will make this choice remains to be seen. The genetic and cultural patterns established across centuries of ruthless political survival don't disappear overnight. The same intelligence, adaptability, and strategic thinking that enabled Tudor-era survival could easily be redirected toward contemporary forms of exploitation and manipulation. Yet there is hope in the very fact that we can trace these patterns, name these inheritances, and consciously choose to break these cycles. Diana's sons understand their family history in ways that she never could. They have access to psychological tools, historical knowledge, and moral frameworks that might finally enable the Spencer bloodline to evolve beyond its predatory origins. The story that began with sheep farmers profiting from the Wars of the Roses might finally end with their descendants using inherited advantages to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to serve rather than exploit. Or it might not. The Tudor legacy that hides in Princess Diana's bloodline remains active, waiting for moments of crisis or opportunity to reassert itself. The same genetic material that survived Henry VIII's reign of terror, the English Civil War, and 2 world wars continues to flow through contemporary Spencer veins, carrying within it all the survival strategies learned during England's darkest hours. As you turn off this video and return to your own life, remember that we all carry inheritances from the past, genetic, cultural, and psychological legacies that shape our choices in ways we rarely recognize. The Spencer family's dark inheritance may be more dramatic than most, but the fundamental challenge remains the same for all of us. How do we honor the survival of our ancestors while refusing to perpetuate their failures? How do we use inherited advantages to serve justice rather than merely to advance our own interests? The Tudor legacy in Diana's bloodline offers no easy answers, but it does provide a sobering reminder that the past never truly dies. It lives on in our DNA, our family stories, our unconscious patterns of behavior, and our deepest assumptions about how the world works. The question that remains, the question that will determine whether the Spencer bloodline finally transcends its dark origins, is whether each new generation will choose to break the ancient patterns of survival through moral compromise, or whether they will continue the cycle that began when their ancestors first learned to profit from other people's blood. In that choice lies not just the fate of one aristocratic family, but a reflection of humanity's eternal struggle between survival and morality, between inherited patterns and conscious transformation, between the darkness we carry from the past and the light we might create for the future. The black band cutting across the Spencer coat of arms will always remain, marking the family's passage through history's darkest chapters. But whether that band represents a legacy of darkness or a commitment to ensuring such darkness never returns depends on choices yet to be made by descendants who carry Tudor blood in their veins and the weight of centuries on their shoulders. The story that began in the shadow of Tower Green on a cold May morning in 1536 AD continues to unfold in boardrooms, palaces, and therapy sessions today. The Tudor legacy hides not just in Princess Diana's bloodline, but in the genetic memory of anyone whose ancestors learned to survive by choosing power over principle, calculation over compassion, survival over justice. We are all, in our way, inheritors of dark legacies. The question is what we choose to do with that inheritance, and whether we have the courage to break the cycles that our ancestors created in their desperate attempts to survive impossible times.